In what state of mind and heart do you suppose the disciples left that Last Supper with Jesus? What must they have experienced? They had to have been unsettled in a certain way. They had to have maybe trembled a little bit. They had to have been bowled over a bit. Because Jesus had just taken something so familiar to them, the Passover meal. There couldn't be anything more familiar. They had celebrated it dozens of times. He had taken that and he had elevated it into a whole new meaning. Take, eat, this is my body. Take and drink, this is my blood of the covenant. All these familiar things Jesus takes and he makes them new. And they must have felt like they must have felt many, many times in their life with Jesus, a little bit unstable, a little bit knocked off balance, like that night when they were in the boat and Jesus comes walking across the water, or when the miracle begins to dawn on them that this small set of loaves and fishes has now fed a multitude. They must have been a little bit trembling that night. I want to give you some points for prayer on this Holy Thursday night so that we ourselves can enter into that mystery. There is nothing more familiar for us than the Eucharist. Every single Sunday we come into church and we celebrate that remarkable sacrament. It's the bedrock of our faith, and it's so familiar to us. And we have to every year, and the church proposes to us every year, to re-enter into the sense of everything is new. What has just happened? The kind of dawning that a whole new vista has been opened up to us. This year, strangely, we have a special help in entering into that lack of balance because of the strange times that we live in. Holy Thursday, this night, would be the night when, like every year, we would come up, we would celebrate the gift of the priesthood, the gift of the Eucharist, and we would receive from this altar our Lord's body and blood, and it would be the most familiar thing in the world to us. And this year, it's not going to happen. There is a strange gift in that, if we can receive it. Because for us for whom this has become so familiar, we are now immersed in an experience that is highly unfamiliar. And the absence of the Eucharist, our inability to receive, is actually going to intensify our appreciation for what it is when we do receive. What is this mystery of the Eucharist? The mystery that always escapes our grasps, that always runs further ahead of us than we can catch up. What is this mystery of the Eucharist? I want to give you 3 points for prayer that interprets from what Jesus has done with the Passover meal, interprets this new gift that he's giving us in the Eucharist. The Eucharist is a sacrifice. The Eucharist is a feast. The Eucharist is a school of the heart. Now, there would have been nothing more obvious to any of the disciples of Jesus that the Passover meal was a feast. For the Jews of Jesus' time, living many, many hundreds of years after the events that pertain to the original Passover, for them, it's a joyful feast every year. You go up to Jerusalem, you make your pilgrimage to the Lord, and there's great joy and feasting there in the city. And it's all centered around this ritualized meal in which you consume the lamb and this special kind of bread, the bread of haste, manna. It would have been so obvious to the disciples, to the Jews of Jesus' time, that the Passover is first of all a great feast. But there's something that comes prior to that chronologically. What comes before the feast is the sacrifice. And it's the sacrifice that makes the feast possible. What is this great sacrifice of Passover? Well, a lamb is slain. And in the original Passover, it is the lamb that is slain so that the Israelites might leave slavery in Egypt. What we're celebrating in this great feast is a mighty act of liberation. But notice what's happened in the Passover. All these signs have come beforehand of God's mighty power, of his outstretched arm. It is none of those deeds of power that sets the Israelites free in the end. It's not turning the Nile to blood. It's not sending the plague of locusts. It's not the frogs. It's not the hail, etc. It's none of these demonstrations of the sheer power that God can wield in nature. None of those set the Israelites free. What sets them free finally is actually an act of God taking weakness on himself, which is symbolized above all in the slaughtering of the lambs. It is us, humans, who inflict so much death on the world. And God says, okay, here's the powerful sign. I will take that death on myself. I will take it on myself. And involuntarily accepting that weakness to the maximal point, to the point beyond which one cannot go, by accepting that weakness to the absolute maximum, that will be the act of liberation. Why? Think back to that first reading we've heard. In the Passover, judgment will be pronounced upon the gods of Egypt. Who are the gods of Egypt? Well, they're not all that different from the gods that we have in our own world today. All those powers and forces that hold out to us an ultimate horizon. You've got pleasure and wealth and honor and health, all these gods that we hold up as the ultimate standard. And the true God shows them not to be gods at all, because he shows in taking on our weakness, in the weakness that we inflict even on others, in the weakness that holds each other in slavery, in taking all of that on, God reveals what is truly powerful, who God truly is, the love that is willing to bear the burden of the other. It will cast judgment, it will pronounce judgment on all the false gods of Egypt, because not a single god like honor or power or money or any of the other gods that we might erect, none of those gods will take on weakness. If they're going to try to save, they're going to try to save through power. They're not going to try to save through weakness. And therefore, they remain completely apart from us. They can never finally enter into my state, because natively, from the very beginning of my life, I am not clothed in honor. I do not have power. I do not have pleasure. I start from the point of mere weakness. By God descending into my weakness, he makes himself present there, and that can be the great act of liberation that brings me out. Because finally, my horizon cannot be pleasure or power or honor or wealth. Finally, my horizon must be the true God, who is love, or else I remain trapped. And so it is sacrifice. It is sacrifice that pronounces the judgment on the gods of Egypt, on our gods. He doesn't remain there, though, because this sacrifice is ordered to something beyond it, which is joy, feasting, the good of union. God liberates me from my slavery to all these other gods precisely so that I might be in union with him. I can't be in union with power. I can't be in union with wealth and prosperity. I can't be in union with honor, but I can be in union with the God who is love, because he has rescued me from my dependence upon all these other gods, my insistence on keeping my world closed down. He's opened me up, and now the feasting can begin. In this great act in which he reinterprets the Passover as his own gift of himself, he must do it in the context of a great feast, because what he's doing is establishing a new banquet in which you and I can be united to him. And the way we always celebrate being together is by sharing what we have in common in the great feast of a meal. The Eucharist will be the definitive sacrifice. It will be leading us to the definitive banquet. It will be the definitive feast. But it is a third thing also. It is also a school of the heart. How so? In the first letter of St. John, he says, "We do not know what we will be in eternity, but we do know this: we will be like God, because we will see him as he is." We've had all these notions of who God must be like, and what they end up being like is merely projections of ourselves. I kind of just picture myself, but bigger and with more things, and more perfectly and completely what I value. We will be like God because we finally will see him for who he is and for what he is like. And who is he? He's the one who hands himself over totally, with reckless abandon, who gives himself to me. We should have anticipated this already, because remember the very night that God comes into the world, there's no place to put him, and so they put him into a feeding trough designed for the animals to feed upon, the manger. From the very first moments of his existence on earth as a human, he's already indicated to us that he has come to us to very sincerely, in all genuineness, hand himself over, to such a degree that we will even consume him. He will be in the feeding trough for us to consume. The Lord must be my sustenance. He must be my daily substance, which keeps me in existence. And he wants to. He wants to give himself over to me. If I see that as what God is like, then my life has to be like it. I want my life to be like it. I want to reflect the best of what I've seen. You might think of it this way. Think of any spectacular feat you've seen, an extraordinary act of playing an instrument, or a remarkable feat in athletics. And the first thing you think is, how do they do that? How in the world do they do that? How could I do that? And if you're a little kid, maybe you start practicing and you imagine the day when you yourself can do that. To see excellence is to want to be like the excellent one whom we have seen. That is the third feature that I wish to propose for your prayer tonight. The Eucharist is a school of the heart. When I see God handing himself over to me, I now see that my life also must follow that pattern. I must, in all sincerity, hand myself over. And guess what? I can. These 3 points I propose for your prayer tonight, as we experience the absence of the Eucharist as an intense and living presence. What is it that I long for when I come to the Eucharist? What is it that I hunger for? What is it that I experience, this most familiar thing in the world? It is the great sacrifice that God makes for me, showing me what God really is like, and doing so at the highest of costs. That the Eucharist is a great feast. It's the joyful banquet in which we can celebrate the extraordinary union, that God lets himself be consumed by me so as to become one with my very own flesh. And finally, the great school of the heart, in which he shows me the possibility for my own life as I enter into the life of exchange of love between Father, Son, and Spirit, the great school of the heart. As we spend some time in reflection this night on this most extraordinary gift, this most familiar of gifts, let's allow the Lord to put us a little off balance, to let us be bowled over a little bit, so that emblazoned upon our heart might be sacrifice and feast and the great school that he is offering us. Amen.